Hello, I'm Juliet Mann, and this is the Agenda podcast, CGTN Europe's one-stop shop for smart, in-depth discussion of the issues that really matter in the world today. For more than half a century, Silicon Valley in the United States has been the epicentre of global technology. But in recent years, the rise of China has certainly challenged that dominance. So how is the tech battle likely to play out? And are there other countries out there ready to become key global players? With me here in the studio to consider that and many other questions is Mehran Gul, author of this book, The New Geography of Innovation. In your book, you explore tech hotspots around the world. What's changed?
So I think the big thing that has changed is China, and that's something that everyone is seeing. But the point of me writing this book was that we need to look beyond the US and China as well, because at some point perceptions do drive reality, and if we keep talking about the global tech race as just the US versus China, then that's what it's going to be, because then that's the two places that are going to get all the investments, all the talent, and we need to widen our debate to places beyond just these two big tech powers.
Now, in the book, you quote the scientist, A.J. Agrawal, saying a lot of places are good at science, but few can turn that science into new technologies and big companies. So why do you think that is?
I think it's a variety of reasons. Usually people tend to focus too much on things like culture, but in my book I talk about institutional reasons as well, because if you keep saying it's culture, then what do we do about that? So in my book, for instance, talk about things like in the US, a lot of the funding that comes for early stage companies comes from big pension funds. And that money, for instance, is absent in places like Germany, because in Germany, when you pay out your pension, you're not paying against a pension that you will draw for yourself in the future, but you're paying a pension for somebody else who's drawing pension today. So that stock of capital is not available.
Silicon Valley has been that epicentre of tech for half a century. Now, you say the Americans are not in a different league, they're playing a different game. Mm-hmm. So what do you mean by that?
So I think you just need to look at company valuations to get a sense of the lead that the US has over the rest of the world. I talk about how the entire value of all the tech companies in the UK combined would be about $1 trillion. Now compare that with the market value of Nvidia, which is $5 trillion. And that's not the only company. You know, Google is $4 trillion, Microsoft is $3 trillion. So that shows you the extent to which there's a massive gap between what the US is up to and what's going on in places like Europe.
But China is certainly the US's biggest tech competitor, and technology has been placed at the very heart of their next 5-year plan. How do you see China's role in the tech world changing during that period?
So I think China, there's always a big gap between where China is and what perceptions of China are. And that's one of the reasons why people getting surprised by what's coming out of China. People got surprised by DeepSeek. Yeah. People got surprised by the fact that 7 out of 10 EVs that are made in the world are made in China. People got surprised by the fact that China at this point has a lead in quantum technologies as well. The fact that the second biggest player in space is China as well. So I think where China is going to be in the next 5 years, we probably first need to get a good sense of where China is right now. And the gap is a lot narrower than we think it is.
Now, Kai-Fu Lee, the founding director of Microsoft Research China, told you that while the US is the teacher, China is the precocious pupil, and a pupil that is out executing the teacher. Is that how you see the current state of affairs?
So what's often said is that the US is really good at putting up ladders, and China is really good at climbing them. And if you look at the companies that got to $1 billion valuation the fastest, 8 out of 10 are from China. Kai-Fu's own company, 01.ai, it got to $1 billion valuation in 6 months as well. So China, even if there isn't a lot that's being invented in China right now, in terms of execution, in terms of engineering excellence, it is doing a lot better than the US. What's often said is the US is really good at getting from 0 to 1. China is really good at getting from 1 to 100. And that's really the competitive advantage that it's shown in the past few years.
So it's that scalability. Give me some examples.
So if you look at Temu, for instance, within a year of its launch, it was the most downloaded app in the US. Within, I think, 10 months of its launch, its sales exceeded $5 billion. There is just company after company. If you look at DJI, for instance, it sells more drones than the entire drone industry combined. BYD outsells the entire German car industry combined when it comes to its exports. And BYD was the company that we were not talking about 3 years ago. So there's just a spate of companies coming from China, one after another, that have managed to reach scale. You almost go from not hearing about those companies at all to those companies being the world leaders in their respective disciplines. And that shows you the extent to which scale plays a huge role in China's strategy today.
Another company that a lot of people weren't talking about is More Threads, who make these chip circuits, and that IPO, the flotation, has been accelerated, has been really pushed forward on the Shanghai Star market. That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and the fact that they can tap into their domestic markets to raise that capital is also interesting as well. If you look at the foreign capital that's been going into China over the past 5 years, that's really plummeted. So the fact that these companies can still survive relying entirely on domestic sources of capital also shows you that Chinese companies are no longer dependent on international markets to the extent that they were. When Alibaba went public, it decided to go public in New York. Now companies are increasingly deciding to, first of all, raise money in local currency and not USD, and secondly, to list locally as well, which is a big shift that's happened.
And in the book, you tell the story of the extraordinary rise of Tencent and point out that tech in China doesn't just work harder, it works faster. Where do you see that heading?
So I think right now it's gone too far in one direction of 996. And if you go to China, the big debate right now is involution, which is over competitiveness. And people talk about Meituan a lot, which was a company that survived with, there were about 5,000 Groupon clones that started in China, and Meituan sort of survived that gladiatorial contest. And in China right now, involution is a big thing. The idea that we probably need to scale back on the competition and people focusing entirely on economic matters, and we need to probably correct in the other direction. So I think there's just too much happening in terms of competition in China, and maybe people need to step away from 996 a little bit.
And what about Tencent itself? Tell us a little bit about that growth story.
So in my book, I talk about the story of David Wallerstein, who was for the longest time the highest-ranking American in not just Tencent, but in the entire Chinese tech ecosystem. And this was a company that started under very modest circumstances, and they sold half the company to an African conglomerate very early in the game. And Tencent went from being initially a company that was simply involved in chat services to then becoming the biggest game vendor in the world, to what eventually became what is often called the Berkshire of tech, a company that holds stakes in over 1,000 companies internationally. And to me, this was a really good prism with which to look at this general shift that you've seen in China from being a place which was a net recipient of capital internationally to a place that is now a net exporter of capital. And you can see that refracted through the experience of David Wallerstein himself. His initial job was to bring outside capital to China, and he eventually became the main person taking Chinese money and investing it in gaming studios and other companies all over the world. And that is a big shift that's happening. China going from a place which took in the world's money to a China being the source of much of investments that are happening in the world today.
It sounds too that diversification is an important part of that jigsaw puzzle.
Diversification, not just in terms of diversifying among different industrial sectors, but also diversifying geographically as well. I think one thing that we will see increasingly in the future is China and the US competing for investments in third geographies, whether that is Europe. You already see the largest gaming studios in Europe being owned by Tencent. I'm talking here about Ubisoft. I'm talking here about Supercell, which was the first company in Europe to cross a $10 billion valuation. I think you will also see this competition playing out in ASEAN as well. The top 3 e-commerce marketplaces in ASEAN, whether that is Shopee or Lazada or TikTok Shop, all have some sort of Chinese connection as well. So you will see this competition between the US and China increasingly not happening on home turf, but also in third geographies as well.
It's so interesting you talk about that competition taking place outside of home turf, but I wonder about the role of geopolitics here. Because there are tensions that remain between China and the United States, particularly around technology, particularly around security. That creates opportunities for other nations, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I think we're very vividly seeing that in Europe right now, where I think as the debate around technology is being linked more and more to security and geopolitics, you are seeing countries that are trying to play one side against the other. In Europe, for instance, very recently, we saw a Chinese chip manufacturer being nationalized in the Netherlands, for instance. We've also seen examples of robotics.
Talking about Nexperia?
Yes.
Yeah.
And we are also seeing in Germany, for instance, acquisitions from Chinese players being blocked. But if later stage capital is not available, Series D, Series C, Series D capital is not available, and Americans are not writing those checks, the big question is, should Europe be more open to taking money from Asia? And I think we only need to look at ASEAN to see how that might work, because over there you don't really see similar levels of resistance to Chinese capital, and you have places like Vietnam who have been taking a lot of money from Chinese investors.
So should Europe be more open to different kinds of investment from different places?
I think that's a question for European policymakers. It's murky territory that I've tried not to get into in the book because it's heavily political. But to leave it at a question, I think the question really is, if the big problem in Europe is that it's a good place to start new companies, but not a good place to scale new companies, and increasingly some of the best European companies, like Hugging Face, for instance, like UiPath, for instance, are increasingly moving across the Atlantic, then what will it take for these companies to have the same capital at home? And if Chinese money is off the table, then what alternatives do they really have to scale their companies?
Well, this brings me to something else that you reference in the book. The Nobel Prize-winning economist, John Tirole. You say that the EU is losing the race for innovation. So, why do you think that is? Have they left it too late to catch up? How will they catch up?
I think there's a variety of factors at play. As I mentioned earlier, even now, we are now maybe 10 years into technology being talked about in terms of a race, and even now you're not seeing those big companies coming from Europe. In fact, most of them are leaving Europe. If you look at the big headline examples of tech companies in Europe, you can think about companies like DeepMind, for instance. If you look at the other companies that we talk about in the same breath as DeepMind, this would be OpenAI, this would be Anthropic, this would be ByteDance. These other companies are all hundreds of $billions in value. And DeepMind was sold for only about $500 million, and it's at this point a subsidiary of an American company. If you look at Revolut, for instance, recently the founder decided to change their domicile to the UAE. So it's still Europe not really showing up to the starting line when it comes to the tech race. The question of why that is the case is a very complex one, but just to take one example, European companies tend to be owned overwhelmingly by their founders versus their employees. If you look at an early stage company in the US, it's owned 20% by its own employee base. In Europe, it is about 10%. And that means when these companies go public, there is less money circulating in the environment for repeat cycles of innovation. So one thing that Europe can really do is to really nudge their companies into being owned more by their own employees versus their founders. And that could lead to better investments down the line.
Why is that something that is so un-European from a cultural point of view?
I think people tend to think in Europe, what's usually said is that people have a very conservative mindset. So if you offer them stock versus the comfort of higher salaries, they would always take higher salaries versus stock. Whereas in the US, the incentives are exactly the other way around, where employees would always value stock a lot more than salaries. And I think that's one cultural change that needs to happen for companies to be owned more by their employee base. If you look at, for instance, the exits that happened with Skype and with PayPal, Skype produced something like 11 millionaires, and PayPal produced over 160. And that's why you've seen the Skype producing company after company, investor after investor. So PayPal producing company after company, investor after investor. And Skype really hasn't had the same kind of an influence over the tech ecosystem in Europe. And that's entirely down to the proportion of the company that was owned by early employees.
So that's something you're talking about. Europe might look to the US to incorporate into the way it does business. What things from the way China does business might Europe look to incorporate to be further ahead in the tech race?
I think what people can learn from China is that there's always this assumption that you need a lot of money or you need a lot of other things like research institutions, universities to work properly before you can show up in the tech race or before you can be competitive. And China kind of leapfrogged all of that to become competitive before its universities got there. And I think this really shows you the power of deployment and of adoption. Where you don't really need to be creating those technologies in order to see their economic benefit. You can just be a good adopter of technology technologies. China was not the place that was the first to develop autonomous vehicles, but if you look at the number of autonomous vehicles on the roads today, China outstrips the rest of the world combined. Similarly, solar technology was not invented in China, but it is the market leader in the world, and China produces more solar panels than the rest of the world combined. There are many different elements at play here. One of which is just social acceptance. I still remember even 5 years ago, people were slashing tires on Waymo autonomous driving taxis in San Francisco. And that sort of extreme techno-skepticism is something that you don't see in places like China today. So having a population that is more receptive to change, that is more receptive to new technologies, it doesn't cost a lot of money to get that. And I think that's one lesson that the world can learn.
I know we've been focusing on Chinese companies and US tech giants too, but there are some European companies that have really been making strides where tech is flourishing. I mean, you say that Silicon Valley might be that best place for high tech, but Germany, you say in your book, Germany is really making waves in deep tech. Talk us through it.
So if you look at 3D printing, for instance, which is an industry that we do not talk about very often, the world's only billion-dollar fortune in 3D printing was made in Germany. This is Hans Lange, who has his own company called 3DS. And it's a company that is operative in industries as diverse as manufacturing car parts to it's the leading company making 3D printed rockets, for instance. But at the same time, a drawback of the German model is that these private companies that have between 500 to 1,000 employees. They never go public. They never really take outside investments. So while in their own niches, they do really well, another company that comes to mind is Heron Connect, which makes tunnels. And whether you are talking about the New York subway system or the subway system in Doha or in Dubai, for instance, all of these tunnels were made by Heron Connect. But the fact that these companies stay small means that they eventually get outcompeted by these bigger players from China that are raising money from the public market. And even if this German company 5 years ago, 10 years ago was the largest tunneling provider in the world, now all three are in China. So there's a lot that's happening in Germany that is best in class on a smaller scale. But in order for these companies to grow, they need to change from this private sector model to companies that grow into mature public companies very swiftly.
You also single out the UK, which by many measures you could say is the third in the tech race. But you point out that given its huge reserves of tech talent and money, it could be maybe doing better.
Yeah. So I think, first, why do I say that, even though the US is number 3, the UK is number 3, it's still underperforming. It is, given the scale of the difference between what's happening in places like the US and the UK, US and China versus the UK. As I mentioned earlier, the entire market value of all tech companies combined in the UK is about $1 trillion. The fact that the one company that we talk about most often when we talk about AI in the UK, which is DeepMind, is at this point 15 years old. The question is, why hasn't there not been another DeepMind? If you look at the US and how many big AI companies have come out from that ecosystem in the past 10 years, you can talk about OpenAI, you can talk about Anthropic, you can talk about Databricks, you can talk about NVIDIA, but in the UK, we're still only talking about DeepMind. So why is that? Why are we not seeing those repeat cycles of innovation? And all the raw material and the ingredients are there. There are things like the UK still gets more international students per capita compared to the US. It gets the most number of international students per capita compared to anywhere else in the world. It's still a very rich country. It has a lot of money in its in circulating in the system. So the question really is, why has it not been able to convert all of those raw materials into new companies and into new technologies?
So talent is a really crucial part of all of this, not just nurturing it, keeping it.
Yeah. And a lot of people say talent is all that it's about, but the interesting thing there is I think talent is equally distributed around the world, but opportunity is not. And there's a reason why a lot of great companies come out of Europe, but then they don't stay in Europe. I talked about Hugging Face earlier, which really plays an outsized role in AI at the moment as the central repository, where anyone who's anyone in AI comes together to share their foundation models. It started in France, probably the most consequential AI company to come out of France in the past 10 years. It's no longer there, or has a small presence there. It's mostly in New York. The fact that UiPath moved there as well, the fact that DeepMind is now a Google subsidiary. So it shows that it's not just about talent. You also need to provide talent the right sort of environment where they can flourish. And that is an area in which Europe still has a long way to go.
So what can companies in Europe, and indeed other parts of the world, do to attract the best minds?
I think talent goes where they think that they can do the best work. And I think the perception that that can happen in Europe or in Africa or in Latin America is still not really there. One thing that I often hear is, Silicon Valley has decentralized. You can have great ideas anywhere. The fact that UiPath comes from Romania shows that great companies can come from anywhere in the world. But what we're also seeing is that these great companies eventually move to established hubs within sort of 5 years of their founding. And that shows the continuing relevance of hubs and being in an environment where other people are doing the same thing. So I think Europe has a lot to catch up on in terms of creating these environments like Shenzhen, like Silicon Valley, where people will feel that they can do their best work.
So your book covers the US, China, the UK, EU, Singapore, Switzerland, Canada, but looking more widely around the world, I'm thinking about the global south in particular, and Africa. Where are the opportunities, or is it too late for those countries to catch up? Because you mentioned in the book that much of the rest of the world seems to be struggling to innovate.
Mm-hmm. So if I were to give you one example, which is if you look at the entire continent of Africa and look at what's the most valuable company in Africa, it's a company called Naspers, and I'm pretty sure it's a company that you haven't heard about very often. Naspers is, in all of Africa, it's the only company that is listed as an internet company. And so how is it that a company that we've never really heard about is the most valuable company in Africa? Well, the story of Naspers is that it bought about half of Tencent 25 years ago, and that stake grew at one point to being worth over $200 billion. And at this point, the entire value of Naspers is based on its stake in Tencent. And on the one hand, while that's a good story to tell about Naspers and its investing acumen, on the other hand, it's a pretty unfortunate story to tell about the African tech ecosystem. The fact that the most valuable company in the continent is one that owns a small stake in a Chinese tech company shows you the volumes of value that's being created in places in Asia, but at the same time, how unfavorably the African continent compares to that. So if you look at every stock market in Africa, you barely see any tech companies in the top 10 most valuable companies. It is still mining companies, it is still banks, old economy companies essentially. And I'm very worried about what's happening in places like Africa, in Latin America. And the book was really written with that spirit in mind, that we keep talking about the same two places when we talk about tech, but how do we change that debate to talking about how does Africa show up at the starting line? How do the Baltic states show up at the starting line? And that's a big debate that we need to have.
Technology is adopted by young people. You talk about Africa. There's a huge workforce there of young people. So there's a disconnect, right? They have the potential, they have the ingredients to be doing more.
Talent is equally distributed. There's no reason why, if it happened in China, it can't happen in other places. There's a map of China that you can see on social media where 50 years ago, just about every region in China was poorer than just about every region in Africa. And now that relationship has flipped entirely. And if I talk about China a lot in that book, it is with that spirit in mind, which is if they could do it, then other people can do it as well.
How important is location now? I mean, you point out that many tech companies, wherever they come from, are far more similar than the industrial giants of the past.
So I think location is still very important. And in that sense, maybe I'm going against zeitgeist a little bit in the sense that over the past 10 years, it's become increasingly common to say that Silicon Valley is not relevant anymore, Shenzhen is not relevant anymore, you can have great ideas anywhere. But all the evidence seems to suggest that, sure, you can have a great idea anywhere, but those entrepreneurs are moving to hubs, within 5 years or 10 years of starting their companies. You just can't beat the advantage of being in an environment where there's a lot of people doing the same thing, and the ecosystem advantage of learning from a lot of other people who are trying to solve the same problem. So I think hubs are not dead. Maybe there'll be more hubs than there were in the past, but we'll definitely see more of this agglomeration happening rather than less.
But does demand make a difference? I mean, is what the likes of China and what the United States demand from their tech innovators different from a country like India or a country like Nigeria?
So I think that's something that comes up very often in discussions about tech as well, that you maybe first need a market that can sustain these tech companies for you to have these hyperscale companies. But if you look at some standout success stories in tech, these are companies that got to scale not by focusing on their domestic or even their regional market, but by thinking global from day one. If you look at a company like Samsung, for instance, Samsung was born when Korea was still an extremely poor country. At independence, South Korea was 3 times poorer than North Korea, which is something that is hard to imagine now. And yet today, Samsung is the most dominant manufacturer of smartphones in the world. 1 out of every 4 smartphones are a Samsung. And they did that not by focusing on their domestic market. South Koreans did not have money to buy Samsung products, but they did that by focusing on international markets. So while you can make an argument about Chinese companies that they got to scale by focusing on their own customers, there are examples in other places where the domestic market was not there, and you got to scale by thinking global from day one. And that's why I think that even if you're in Africa, even if you're in Latin America, and your own continent is maybe not at par with other places, you can still think global from day one and have companies that can compete internationally.
Artificial intelligence, again, a global technology, that's a huge part of this conversation. Do you see its development following the existing dynamics of the tech world? So the US versus China, OpenAI versus DeepSeek, or are there real opportunities for other players to get involved?
I think there are other companies that are coming up. There's WinBrain that came out of Vietnam that was acquired by NVIDIA. There is a great company in Sweden called Lovable, which is one of the fastest growing companies in the world today. But if you look deeper into their stories, there's still somehow some connection with either the US or China. WinBrain, as I mentioned, was acquired by NVIDIA. That already shows you that the US is swooping up these companies wherever they might be born. Lovable is very heavily dependent on Anthropic's foundation models. So that is a worrying sort of element where anywhere that you see an important AI company in the world, there will be some sort of connection to them being dependent on companies in these 2 big tech powers. And so and because of that dependence, a lot of value that they create eventually migrates to these places as well. Aleph Alpha was a German company that was big in that was trying to be big in AI. They've pivoted away from making their own models. So I do unfortunately think that AI at this moment is primarily the US and China, but hopefully that can change in the future.
And finally, the multi-trillion-dollar question. What then do you think the key is to fostering true technological innovation? If I'm a developing nation looking to get ahead in this sector, where should I start?
That's a much longer answer than I can fit into in one sentence. I think it's dealt with in more detail in the book. But I think one thing that people can do is look at examples from more countries than what we're used to. I think it's a bit of a cliche to always look at Silicon Valley, always look at Shenzhen. If you look at other countries, maybe you can find problems that they've solved that these bigger tech powers are still struggling to come to terms with. A big question over there would be, we've just come to accept that innovation just happens in new companies, and it's creative destruction. It's one wave gets replaced by the next. But if you look at South Korea, for instance, you have these companies like Samsung, Hyundai, LG, which have been around for 80 years and are still punching at the highest level globally in tech. And so, there's a lot that even companies like NVIDIA would have to learn from these South Korean companies. There's a lot that companies like ByteDance can learn from these South Korean companies. So I think the first thing that you can really do is look at these examples of success that are not limited to the US and China, see what they're doing, and try and adopt piecemeal strategies from around the world.
Mehran Gul, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find more agenda content on CGTN Europe's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, and YouTube channels. Until next time, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
and always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.